How would you feel if on your 25th wedding anniversary, instead of receiving a gift, the man you'd spent your entire adult life with stood before hundreds of guests and declared, 25 years is quite enough. I want someone younger. And tomorrow you're moving out of the house. I, Elaine Peterson, 55 years old, living in Chicago, stood frozen when I heard those words. Not whispered in a kitchen corner, not behind closed doors, but right there on the speaker's platform, in front of friends, colleagues, and family. And worse, the man saying this wasn't just my husband, Victor. Behind him stood his mother's scheming hand and a young mistress sitting smugly in the corner of the room, smiling. They had calculated to humiliate me, to turn me into the ex-wife on my own wedding anniversary. But Victor had forgotten one thing. The house we lived in wasn't his. It was a gift my parents had left me before we even married, and more than that, just weeks before. I had inherited a substantial estate from my aunt in California, something that would turn his betrayal plot into ashes. That night, I didn't scream or collapse. I simply made a promise to myself. If they want to turn our anniversary into a stage for humiliation, I'll turn it into a theater of truth. And my sweet revenge will be justice. Right before everyone's eyes. My name is Elaine Peterson, and for 25 years, I believed I was living a love story. I was wrong. I was living a lie, carefully constructed by people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient placeholder until something better came along. Victor and I met in 1998 when we were both young professionals in Chicago. He was ambitious, charming, with dreams of building a business empire. I was a certified public accountant with a steady job. And, more importantly to him than I realized at the time, a family home inherited from my parents who had passed in a car accident the year before. The house on Maple Street was beautiful, a three-story Victorian with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a garden that my mother had tended with love for 30 years. When Victor first saw it, his eyes lit up in a way I mistook for appreciation of its beauty. Now I understand it was calculation. Our early years felt like a fairy tale. Victor was attentive, romantic, always talking about our future and building something together. When he suggested moving into my house after our honeymoon, it seemed natural. Why pay rent when you have this beautiful place? He'd said, spinning me around the living room. We can save money for investments, maybe start that consulting firm I've been dreaming about. I was so in love, so eager to build a life with him, that I never questioned why he never contributed to the mortgage payments that were still outstanding on the house. You've got it handled, babe, he'd say with that charming smile. I'm focusing on growing our future wealth. Our future wealth that somehow never quite materialized. Victor's mother, Tamara, had been skeptical of our marriage from the beginning. She was a cold woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper opinions about what her son deserved. At our wedding, she'd pulled me aside and said, I hope you understand that Victor has big dreams. He needs a wife who won't hold him back. I'd smiled and nodded, thinking she was just being protective. I didn't realize she was issuing a warning. The first few years were good, or at least I thought they were. Victor started his consulting business, using my house as collateral for his business loans. It's just on paper, he assured me. The bank needs to see assets. You trust me, don't you? Of course I trusted him. He was my husband. But slowly, things began to change. Victor became more critical. more distant. He started working late nights, weekend trips for business development. When I'd ask questions, he'd dismiss them with irritation. Why can't you just support me instead of interrogating me? Don't you want us to succeed? The subject of children came up frequently in those early years. I'd always wanted a family, and at first, Victor seemed eager too. But after two miscarriages and several failed rounds of fertility treatments, something shifted in him. He became cold about the topic, eventually declaring that maybe we weren't meant to be parents. What hurt most wasn't just his giving up, it was the way he began to make comments. Maybe it's for the best, he'd say. Kids are expensive. And honestly, with your family history of complications. He never finished those sentences, but the implication was clear. I was defective. I was disappointing him. Tamara, of course, had opinions about our childlessness too. Poor Victor, she'd sigh during family dinners. He'd make such a wonderful father. It's such a shame when these things don't work out. The way she looked at me made it clear who she blamed. By our 10th anniversary, I was working longer hours to support Victor's struggling business ventures. He'd gone through several failed startups, each time convincing me that the next one would be different. I just need more capital, he'd say. Maybe we could get a second mortgage on the house? It's sitting here, not working for us. I refused. Something in my gut told me not to risk my parents' house, the one solid thing I had left of them. Victor was furious. You don't believe in me, he accused. What's the point of having assets if you won't use them to build our future? Our 15th anniversary passed quietly. Victor barely acknowledged it. When I mentioned feeling disappointed, he accused me of being needy and living in the past. We're not kids anymore, Elaine. Romance is for people who don't have real responsibilities. But the real change began around our 20th anniversary. Victor started going to the gym obsessively, buying new clothes, paying attention to his appearance in ways he hadn't since our dating years. When I complimented him on looking good, he'd shrug and say, "Someone has to make an effort around here." That's when the criticism of my appearance began. Don't you think you should update your wardrobe? He'd ask. Maybe try some of those anti aging creams? I mean, we're not getting any younger. He'd say it with a laugh, as if it were a joke. But the message was clear. Tamara's visits became more frequent, and her comments more pointed. Victor looks so young and vital, she'd observe, looking at me meaningfully. It must be hard when couples age differently. She'd examine my gray roots, my laugh lines, my modest clothes with the scrutiny of an appraiser, determining the value of old furniture. I started noticing other things too. Victor would step away to take phone calls, speaking in hushed tones. He'd receive text messages at odd hours and quickly put his phone face down. When I asked about them, he'd say, "Just work stuff. Nothing that would interest you." The distance between us grew wider each year. We slept in the same bed but lived separate lives. Victor would come home late, eat dinner while scrolling through his phone, then disappear into his home office. Weekends were spent on his business development activities that somehow never included me. By our 23rd anniversary, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Victor had become someone I barely recognized, critical, dismissive, treating me like an inconvenience rather than a partner. But I kept hoping things would improve. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, was more supportive, more understanding, he'd remember why he'd married me. I threw myself into my work as a senior accountant at a mid sized firm. My colleagues respected me, my clients trusted me, and my expertise was valued. At work, I felt competent and appreciated. At home, I felt invisible and inadequate. The isolation was the worst part. Victor had systematically discouraged my friendships over the years. Why do you need to go out with Linda? Don't we spend enough time together? He'd say, when I made plans with friends. Besides, she's always complaining about her husband. I don't want that negativity affecting you. Gradually, I'd lost touch with most of my social circle. Victor's friends became our friends, and his family became our family. I was completely dependent on him for companionship, which made his growing coldness even more devastating. But then, 2 months before our 25th anniversary, everything changed. My Aunt Dorothy in California, my mother's sister, who I'd stayed in touch with over the years, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. I was her only living relative, and to my complete shock, she'd left me everything in her will. The inheritance was substantial. Two rental properties in San Diego worth over $800,000 combined, plus investment accounts totaling nearly $400,000, and her beautiful coastal home worth another $600,000. I was suddenly worth nearly $2 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. When I told Victor about the inheritance, his reaction was immediate and telling. His eyes lit up with that same calculating gleam I'd seen when he first saw my parents' house. This is incredible, Elaine. We can finally do all those things we've talked about. Expand the business, maybe buy that vacation home we've looked at. This changes everything for us. US, our money, our future. He was already spending it in his mind. But something had shifted in me during Aunt Dorothy's funeral. Standing beside her grave, thinking about how she'd lived independently until the end, traveled the world, made her own choices, I realized how small my life had become, how much I'd given up, how little I'd received in return. I decided to keep quiet about the exact amount of the inheritance. When Victor pressed for details, I was vague. It's substantial, but I'm still working through all the paperwork with her lawyers. These things take time. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already spoken to Dorothy's attorney, who'd advised me to keep the inheritance separate from our marital assets. Given that it's an inheritance received during marriage, it would typically be considered separate property anyway, but I'd recommend keeping it in accounts with only your name on them, just to be safe. I followed his advice. For the first time in 25 years, I had money that was truly, completely mine. But I also started paying attention to Victor's behavior in ways I hadn't before. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the sudden interest in his appearance. It all looked different through the lens of my new financial independence. And that's when I began to notice Marina. Marina first appeared at Victor's office Christmas party 3 months before our anniversary. She was introduced as the new executive assistant, young blonde, probably early 30s, with the kind of figure that looked effortless, but probably required a personal trainer and a strict diet. "This is Marina," Victor said when he introduced us, his hand lingering on her lower back. "She's been a tremendous help getting the business organized." Marina smiled at me with perfectly white teeth and eyes that assessed me like a jeweler examining a stone and finding it lacking in clarity and value. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice sweet as artificial vanilla. Victor talks about you all the time. The way she said it suggested that what he said wasn't particularly flattering. I watched them together that night. The way she laughed at his jokes, jokes I'd heard 100 times and had stopped finding funny years ago. The way she touched his arm when she spoke to him. The way he straightened his tie and smiled wider when she was around. I recognized the signs because I remembered being on the receiving end of that attention once upon a time. The difference was that when Victor had courted me, I was young and naive and thought it meant forever. Marina was young but calculating, and she knew exactly what she was doing. The next morning, I woke up at 3 a.m. with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I found Victor in his office, scrolling through his phone and smiling at the screen in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. "Can't sleep?" I asked from the doorway. He jumped, quickly closing his phone. "Just answering some work emails." You know how it is. But I'd seen enough to catch a glimpse of text messages with heart emojis. We hadn't used heart emojis with each other since the early 2000s. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention. Victor began working even later, often not coming home until after 9 p.m. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me vague answers about client meetings and business development. He started going to the gym every morning before work and every evening after, a routine that was supposedly about staying healthy, but seemed to coincide perfectly with when Marina would post her own gym selfies on social media. Yes, I looked her up online. Sue me. Marina Rodriguez was 29 years old, recently divorced, with an Instagram full of bikini photos and inspirational quotes about living your best life and never settling for less than you deserve. She posted frequently about expensive dinners at restaurants I recognized, the same restaurants where Victor claimed to be having business meetings. But I needed more than social media posts and suspicious behavior. If I was going to protect myself, I needed proof. The breakthrough came 3 weeks before our anniversary. I was doing laundry when I found a receipt in Victor's pants pocket. Dinner for two at Alinea, one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago, on a Tuesday night when he told me he was working late on a proposal. The receipt was for $400 for a man who regularly complained about my grocery bills being too high. That night, while Victor was in the shower, I went through his jacket pockets. I found more receipts: jewelry stores, lingerie shops, a wine bar in Marina's neighborhood, and most damning of all, a hotel key card from the Palmer House Hilton dated just 4 days earlier. My hands were shaking as I photographed everything with my phone. 25 years of marriage, and my husband was buying lingerie for another woman. But I forced myself to think logically. I was an accountant, trained to analyze financial information and look for patterns. If Victor was planning to leave me, he'd be planning financially too. I started monitoring our joint accounts more carefully. Victor had always handled most of our banking, claiming he was better with numbers. A laughable assertion given that I was literally a professional accountant and he'd run 3 businesses into the ground. But I'd let him manage things because I thought it made him feel important. Now, I saw what he'd really been doing. Over the past 6 months, he'd been moving money out of our joint savings account and into accounts I didn't have access to. Small amounts at first, $200 here, $500 there, but it added up to nearly $15,000, transferred to accounts in only his name. He was financially preparing to leave me. The only question was when and how. I decided to do some financial preparation of my own. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, using only my maiden name. I began slowly transferring my own money there. My salary, which had always gone into our joint account, now went directly to my personal account. When Victor asked about it, I told him I was reorganizing my finances in preparation for handling the inheritance. He accepted this explanation readily, probably because he was busy organizing his own financial deception. I also made an appointment with a divorce attorney, not because I was ready to file, but because I needed to understand my rights. Sarah Chen had been a classmate in college who'd gone to law school while I'd gone into accounting. She was now a successful family law attorney with a reputation for protecting her clients' interests. Elaine, Sarah said when I walked into her office, I have to say, you look exactly the same as you did in college. She was being kind, but I appreciated the warmth in her voice. It had been a long time since someone had spoken to me with genuine affection. I told her everything: the suspicious behavior, the financial transfers, the young assistant, the growing coldness in our marriage. Sarah listened without judgment, taking notes. The good news is that the house is yours, she said when I finished. Since it was inherited before marriage and you never added Victor's name to the deed, it remains your separate property. The same goes for your aunt's inheritance. As long as you keep it separate and don't commingle it with marital funds, it's yours alone. What about the money he's been moving out of our joint accounts? That's more complicated. Since those were marital funds, you're entitled to half of everything that was earned during the marriage. We can trace where that money went and demand it back as part of the divorce settlement. I'm not sure I'm ready for divorce, I admitted. Part of me keeps hoping this is just a midlife crisis, that he'll come to his senses. Sarah's expression was gentle, but firm. Elaine, from what you've told me, this isn't a sudden crisis. This sounds like a man who's been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe longer. The question isn't whether he's going to leave you. It's whether you're going to let him do it on his terms or yours. Her words hit me like a physical blow, but they also clarified something that had been nagging at me. Victor wasn't having doubts about our marriage. He'd already decided to end it. The only question was how much damage he planned to inflict on his way out. I left Sarah's office with a clear understanding of my legal position and a recommendation for a private investigator. If you're going to need proof of infidelity for the divorce proceedings, it's better to have professional documentation, she explained. The private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Janet Brooks, was efficient and discreet. Within 2 weeks, she had photographs of Victor and Marina holding hands at restaurants, kissing in parking lots, entering and leaving hotels together. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. But the most shocking discovery came when Janet ran a background check on Marina. She wasn't just Victor's employee. She was his business partner in a new consulting firm he'd registered 6 months earlier. A firm that was planning to compete directly with his current business once he transitioned away from his existing commitments. He's been using your home as collateral for the existing business while secretly starting a new business with his girlfriend, Janet explained. When he leaves, he'll bankrupt the old business and move all the good clients to the new one. You'd be left holding the debt on a failed company while he starts fresh with a clean slate and a young wife. The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Victor hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been systematically planning to destroy my financial security while building his new life with Marina. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: my inheritance. And there was one thing I hadn't told him: the exact amount. As our anniversary approached, Victor became increasingly solicitous. He suggested we have a big party to celebrate 25 years together. "Let's invite everyone," he said with enthusiasm that seemed genuine if you didn't know what I knew. "Your colleagues, my business contacts, all our friends and family. Let's make it a night to remember." I agreed, understanding now that this wasn't going to be a celebration. It was going to be a public execution. Victor was planning to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, probably as a way to justify his actions. If he could make me look like the problem, the failed wife who couldn't keep her husband happy, then his behavior would seem more reasonable. Fine. If he wanted an audience for his betrayal, he'd have one. But he'd also have an audience for the consequences. I spent the week before our anniversary making my own preparations. I had Janet provide me with copies of all her evidence. I had Sarah draft paperwork that would be ready to file the day after the anniversary party. And most importantly, I had the documents proving that both the house and my inheritance were my separate property, legally protected from any claims Victor might make. The night before our anniversary, I lay in bed next to my husband of 25 years, listening to him breathe and knowing it would be the last time. He had no idea that I knew about Marina, about their business, about his plan to leave me with nothing while he rode off into the sunset with a younger woman and my money. But I knew, and I was ready. Victor thought he was going to make our anniversary about his new beginning. Instead, it was going to be about mine. The next evening, as I put on my navy blue dress, the one that made my eyes look bright and my figure look strong, I looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I liked what I saw. Not because I looked young or perfect, but because I looked like a woman who knew her worth. Victor appeared in the doorway behind me, adjusting his tie. "You look nice," he said absently, the way you might compliment a coworker's haircut. "Thank you," I replied. "You look like a man with something to say." He smiled, not catching the edge in my voice. "I do have a few words prepared for tonight. I think people will be surprised." "I'm sure they will be," I said, turning to face him. "I'm sure they will be." The Fairmont Hotel ballroom looked beautiful. Victor had spared no expense. Fresh flowers, soft lighting, a jazz quartet playing softly in the background. Over 100 guests mingled with cocktails, people from every aspect of our life together. My colleagues from the accounting firm, Victor's business associates, neighbors from our street, family members who'd known us since we were newlyweds. I worked the room gracefully, accepting congratulations and well wishes. 25 years, people kept saying. "You two are so lucky to have found lasting love." If only they knew. I spotted Marina immediately. She was wearing a red dress that was slightly too tight and slightly too short for a married couple's anniversary party. But she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won a prize. She'd positioned herself near the bar where she could watch the proceedings while staying close to the exit. Tamara, Victor's mother, held court near the head table, accepting compliments on behalf of the happy couple, as if she'd personally arranged our marriage. She kept glancing at me with barely concealed impatience, as if I were taking too long to exit the stage. And then there was Victor. working the crowd with unusual energy. He was animated, charming, shaking hands and laughing at jokes. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his watch, the nervous energy of someone building up courage for something difficult. In the corner of the room, almost hidden behind a flower arrangement, sat a man I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, sharp suit, briefcase at his feet. He had the look of someone who was there on business rather than celebration. I had a feeling I knew exactly what business that was. The dinner was excellent. Prime rib and salmon, expensive wine, chocolate mousse for dessert. Victor kept the conversation light, telling stories about our early years together, painting a picture of a happy marriage that had simply run its course. "We were so young when we got married," he said to the table. "Sometimes people just grow in different directions." I smiled and nodded, and played the role of the agreeable wife one last time. But I was also watching. Marina looked increasingly confident as the evening progressed, occasionally catching Victor's eye and smiling. Tamara grew more animated, clearly anticipating something. The mysterious man in the corner kept checking his phone. After dinner, the band leader stepped aside, and Victor approached the microphone. The room quieted as he tapped it gently, that familiar sound drawing everyone's attention. "Good evening, everyone," Victor began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate. Well, to celebrate 25 years of marriage with my wife, Elaine." Polite applause rippled through the room. I maintained my composure, sitting at the head table with my hands folded in my lap, watching my husband of a quarter century prepare to destroy me in public. "25 years," Victor continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's a long time. A quarter of a century? When Elaine and I were 20-something kids, 25 years seemed like forever, like an entire lifetime." More nods and smiles from the audience. People were settling in for a sentimental speech about enduring love. "But the thing about a lifetime," Victor said, his tone beginning to shift, "is that sometimes you realize you've been living the wrong life." The room grew quieter. People sensed a change in direction. Elaine and I. Victor paused, looking directly at me. In his eyes, I saw not love or even regret, but something worse: pity. "Elaine and I have grown apart. We want different things. We've become different people, and I think, I think it's time to be honest about that." The tension in the room was palpable now. This was not the speech anyone had expected to hear. "Marriage is about growth," Victor continued, warming to his theme. "And sometimes, growth means having the courage to admit when something isn't working anymore. When you're both just going through the motions." I felt the eyes of 100 people turning toward me, waiting to see how I would react to this public dismantling of our marriage. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable. A few seemed to be reaching for their phones, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. "So, tonight," Victor said, his voice gaining strength and conviction, "instead of celebrating the past, I want to talk about the future, my future. And I want to be clear about something that Elaine and I have discussed." He hadn't discussed anything with me, but I remained silent. "I've asked Elaine to move out of our house so that we can both start fresh. Clean slate, new beginnings. It's what's best for both of us." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. I heard gasps, saw people looking back and forth between us, trying to process what they were hearing. This wasn't just a divorce announcement. This was a public eviction notice. Victor held up his hand for quiet. I know this is unexpected, but sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is give them the freedom to find their own path. Elaine deserves that freedom, and so do I. He was good. I had to give him that. He'd managed to make abandoning his wife sound like an act of kindness. So, I want to raise a glass, Victor continued, reaching for his champagne flute, to new beginnings. To the courage to change, and to the 25 years that brought us to this moment of liberation. He lifted his glass toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Around the room, people sat frozen, unsure whether they were supposed to toast or flee. That's when I stood up. The room went completely silent as I rose from my chair, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the microphone. Victor stepped aside, probably expecting me to deliver some gracious speech about mutual respect and amicable separation. Instead, I gently but firmly took the microphone from his hand. "Thank you, Victor," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You're absolutely right about one thing. It's time for honesty." I turned to face the audience, all those familiar faces staring back at me with a mixture of curiosity and horror. "Ladies and gentlemen, my husband has just announced that he's ending our marriage and asking me to leave our home. What he hasn't mentioned is that he's been planning this announcement for months while carrying on an affair with his employee, Marina Rodriguez, who I believe is sitting right over there by the bar." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. All eyes turned to Marina, who went pale and started looking frantically for the exit. "He also hasn't mentioned," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "that the house he's asking me to leave isn't actually his house. It's mine. I inherited it from my parents before we were married, and his name has never been on the deed." Victor's face had gone from confident to confused to alarmed. "Elaine, what are you doing? Can we please discuss this privately?" I ignored him and kept speaking to the room. He's also failed to mention that over the past 6 months, he's been secretly moving money out of our joint accounts and into accounts with only his name on them. Or that he started a competing business with his girlfriend, using our home as collateral for loans that I never signed. The murmurs in the crowd were getting louder. People were pulling out phones, some to record, others probably to text updates to friends who weren't there. "But here's what Victor doesn't know," I said, looking directly at him now. His face had gone completely white. 3 months ago, I inherited a substantial estate from my aunt in California. We're talking about nearly $2 million in real estate and investments. Victor's mouth actually fell open. Even Tamara looked stunned. When I told Victor about the inheritance, he immediately started making plans for how we would spend our windfall. But since I knew about his affair and his financial manipulations, I made sure to keep every penny of that inheritance in my name alone, legally separate from any marital assets. I turned back to the audience, many of whom were now leaning forward in their chairs, completely absorbed in this real-life drama playing out before them. So, Victor is absolutely right. It's time for a new beginning, but he seems to have misunderstood who's going to be starting fresh. Victor, honey, you're the one who's going to be moving out. Tonight. Security is waiting outside to escort you to collect your personal belongings, and my attorney will be in touch tomorrow about divorce proceedings. The room exploded into chaos. People were talking, shouting questions, standing up to get better views. Flash photography lit up the space as phones captured every angle of the scene. Victor grabbed my arm, his face desperate. Elaine, you can't be serious. We can work this out. This is just a misunderstanding. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. The only misunderstanding, Victor, was me thinking that 25 years of marriage meant something to you. But don't worry. You and Marina can start your new consulting business together. You'll just have to do it without my house as collateral and without my money as startup capital. That's when Marina made her mistake. She stood up from her place at the bar and shouted across the room. He told me you were already separated. He said you were just living together for financial convenience. The room went dead silent. Even the jazz quartet stopped playing. I smiled at Marina with genuine sweetness. Oh, honey, that's adorable. Did he also tell you about the 3 credit cards he's maxed out taking you to expensive restaurants? Or the loan he took against his business equipment to pay for your little weekend getaways? Because I have all the financial records right here. I pulled out a folder from my purse. Yes, I'd brought documentation to my own anniversary party and held it up. Victor owes approximately $47,000 in personal credit card debt and another $23,000 in business loans. Since those are his debts alone and not marital debt, he'll be responsible for paying them back himself on a consultant's salary without a house to live in. Marina's face went from white to green. She looked at Victor with the expression of someone who just realized she'd been betting on a horse that was already dead. But the good news, I continued cheerfully, is that you two will have plenty of time to figure it out together. I've already had the locks changed on my house, and Victor's belongings are being packed as we speak. You're welcome to the vacation rental cabin in Wisconsin. Victor can keep that in the divorce. It should make a lovely starter home. Victor was making strangled sounds, trying to form words. Finally, he managed. You can't do this. I have rights. I'm your husband. You're about to be my ex-husband, I corrected. And yes, you have rights. You have the right to half of the marital assets we accumulated together. Let's see. That would be half of the vacation cabin, half of your car, and half of your business equipment. Oh, and half of your debts, but since those are your debts from your affair, you get to keep all of those. By now, people were openly laughing. The shock had worn off and been replaced by the kind of fascination people feel when watching a perfectly executed takedown of someone who clearly deserved it. The mysterious man in the corner had approached the head table and was standing nearby with his briefcase. I nodded to him. Victor, I'd like you to meet James Romanoff, the attorney you hired to handle our divorce papers. Yes, I know about him too. Mr. Romanoff, would you like to explain to my husband how community property law works when one spouse has been hiding assets and committing adultery? Romanoff looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson, I should mention that I've decided not to represent Mr. Peterson in this matter due to conflicts of interest that have come to light. Victor spun around to stare at his lawyer. What conflicts of interest? Well, Romanoff said reluctantly, when I did the preliminary research for your case, I discovered that the primary marital asset, your home, is actually your wife's separate property. I also discovered evidence of your affair and your financial misconduct. Ethically, I can't help a client defraud their spouse. The final piece fell into place. Victor wasn't just losing his wife, his home, and his girlfriend's respect. He was also losing his legal representation. Victor looked around the room desperately, seeing the faces of colleagues, friends, and family members who now knew exactly what kind of man he was. Some looked disgusted, others looked embarrassed for him, and a few were still recording everything on their phones. "This is insane," he said weakly. "Elaine, please, can we just can we go somewhere private and discuss this like adults?" I walked over to him and placed my hand gently on his arm, the same way I'd done thousands of times during our marriage when I was trying to comfort or support him. "Victor," I said softly so only he could hear, "you stood up in front of everyone I care about and tried to humiliate me. You planned to throw me away like garbage after 25 years so you could play house with a girl young enough to be our daughter. You tried to steal my money, my home, and my dignity." I paused, looking into his eyes that had once looked at me with love, and now looked at me with something closer to fear. "The difference between you and me," I continued, "is that when I destroy someone's life, I make sure they deserve it first." I stepped back and addressed the room one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This has indeed been a night I'll remember for the rest of my life. The bar remains open, the music will continue, and I hope you'll stay and enjoy yourselves. After all, we are celebrating. We're celebrating the end of a marriage that should have ended years ago, and the beginning of a much better chapter." I raised my champagne glass in a toast to new beginnings, honest endings, and the courage to know the difference. The applause started slowly, then built to a roar. People were cheering, whistling, stamping their feet. My colleagues from work were beaming at me with pride. Even some of Victor's business associates were clapping. Victor stood in the middle of it all. A man who'd walked into his own anniversary party planning to humiliate his wife, and walked out having destroyed his own reputation, lost his home, his money, his girlfriend, and his dignity. Marina had already fled. Tamara was staring at me with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition that she'd underestimated me for 25 years. As the crowd returned to their conversations and the jazz quartet resumed playing, I walked to the exit. Several people stopped me to offer congratulations or words of support. My old friend Linda from college grabbed my hand and said, "Elaine, that was the most magnificent thing I've ever witnessed. I am so proud of you." At the door, I turned back one last time to look at the party that was supposed to have been my public humiliation. Instead, it had become something else entirely: a celebration of justice, a demonstration of what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. Victor was still standing near the microphone, looking lost and broken. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even satisfaction. Just nothing. 25 years of marriage, and it ended with a stranger looking back at me. I walked out into the Chicago night, breathing in the cool air and feeling lighter than I had in decades. Tomorrow, I would start the legal proceedings for divorce. Next week, I would begin planning my move to California, to the beautiful coastal home my aunt had left me. But tonight, I was going home to my house, the one my parents had given me, the one I'd protected even when I wasn't sure why I was protecting it. I was going to make myself a cup of tea, run a hot bath, and plan the rest of my life. Because Victor had been right about one thing: 25 years was enough, more than enough. It was time for something better. 6 months later, I was sitting on the deck of my aunt's house in La Jolla, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and pink. The divorce was final. The house in Chicago had been sold at a significant profit, and well, Victor was learning to live on a consultant's salary while paying off his debts and splitting rent on a studio apartment with Marina. Yes, they were still together. Love conquers all, apparently, even financial ruin and public humiliation. I'd received a few awkward emails from him in the months after the anniversary party. Attempts at reconciliation, accusations of cruelty, pleas for a more generous settlement. I'd forwarded them all to my attorney and blocked his email address. Some people thought I'd been too harsh. A few mutual friends suggested I should have handled things privately, spared him the public embarrassment. To those people, I had a simple response. He made it public when he decided to announce his intentions in front of 100 people. I just made sure the whole truth came out, not just his version. The truth was powerful. Within a week of our anniversary party, the story had spread through Chicago's business community like wildfire. Victor's consulting firm lost several major clients who decided they didn't want to work with someone of such questionable character. Marina found herself unemployed when her previous job decided they didn't want the drama she brought with her. Meanwhile, my career flourished. Several of the business owners who'd been at the party approached me about handling their accounting. Word spread that I was not only competent, but also someone who couldn't be intimidated or taken advantage of. My client base tripled within 6 months. But more than the professional success, I'd found something I'd forgotten I'd lost: myself. Living alone in my beautiful California home, I rediscovered interests I'd abandoned, friendships I'd neglected, dreams I'd put aside. I took painting classes, learned to surf, badly, but enthusiastically, joined a book club, volunteered at the local animal shelter. I was happy, actually, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't been since before I'd met Victor. The house phone rang as I was watching the last sliver of sun disappear into the ocean. I almost didn't answer it. Telemarketers were persistent, even in paradise. But something made me pick up. Hello? Mrs. Peterson? This is Jennifer Walsh from Chicago Magazine. I'm calling because we're doing a feature story on empowering life changes, and several people have suggested we include your story. Would you be interested in being interviewed? I smiled, looking out at the endless ocean and thinking about all the women who might be sitting in their own kitchens right now, wondering if they had the strength to change their lives. Yes, I said, I'd be very interested. Because if there's one thing I learned from my 25-year marriage and its spectacular ending, it's this: we teach people how to treat us. Oh. For too long, I taught Victor that I would accept less than I deserved. But it's never too late to change the curriculum, and sometimes the best lessons are the ones that everyone else gets to learn from too. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever wondered whether you have the strength to start over, if you've ever been told you should be grateful for less than you deserve, this story is for you. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of so much more than settling. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? What would you have done in Elaine's situation? Share this story if it resonated with you, and subscribe to Grandma True Stories for more tales of women who refuse to be overlooked, undervalued, or forgotten. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is show the world exactly who we are and exactly what we won't accept.